Peaceful Australian Network and a committee member of Australians for War Powers Reform. Good day, Cameron, come on.
All right, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Cool. When I go to slideshow, it's not playing the game, so I'll just leave it as it is here. I'm coming today from Brisbane, so the Turrbal and Yugara people's land. I would love to have been there, but unfortunately couldn't make it. Okay, so I guess I've been on a bit of a journey. I joined the army when I was 17 years old, straight out of high school. I thought we were on the side of the good guys. I thought we were there to help people and protect those values that this country supposedly stands for, things such as freedom, democracy, and a fair go. I think I might be a bit of a slow learner. It took me a long while to come to the conclusion that the role of the Australian Defence Force was not primarily to defend Australia, but rather to support US imperialism. And by the time I'd sort of fully come to terms with that, I'd realised it was time to leave the Defence Force. Our current defence strategy is fundamentally flawed and is likely to cause us great harm, possibly for generations to come. Therefore, we need an alternative defence strategy that is fit for purpose for our security, for our prosperity, and equally as important for our democracy, and what Bevan outlined earlier, I fully support. And what we also need to do is make sure that we address the real threats that are facing this country. And I would put things such as the health of our soil, our water, our climate, and our energy far above any military threats that this country faces. These are the fundamental building blocks of the society, which if we continue on this militaristic path, are going to bring us unstuck. So my talk this afternoon, I'm going to focus on why our current defence strategy is flawed, and then provide a brief outline of how I think we could approach an alternative defence strategy. So when I look at the map, the first question I ask myself is, who wants to harm Australia? And we're very fortunate, based on both our geography and the countries in our region, that there's no one that actually intends us to harm us. So we're very fortunate there. But what that means is two things. First of all, the most likely cause of someone wanting to harm us is either through actions that we take as a country, or more likely, our involvement and entanglement with alliances such as the United States, as Senator Shoebridge very eloquently described previously. But we have this culture of fear in this country, and it's not an accident we have this, because it's very well funded, very well organised, and we can see some of the most egregious examples of it on the screen. If you remember the red alert from earlier this year, under investigation, quite crazy stuff. But even day to day, we still see these, anti-China, embedded in virtually every piece on China in our mainstream media, or those pushing us towards war with China. There's this negativity. And if you haven't been aware, recently the House in the US passed a $1.6 billion bill over 4 years to spread anti-Chinese propaganda. And you can bet your bottom dollar that a proportion of that will end up in Australia, and it will end up funding activities such as those of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And when we think about the source of our prosperity for decades previously and for decades to come, is based on China, it's quite crazy to think that we're going down this path. So earlier in the year, we had the National Defence Strategy released, and we've adopted a strategy of denial, which has 3 objectives, as you can see there: to shape our environment, to deter actions against our interests, and respond with military force when required. And within the strategy, it says that the deterrence is now our primary defence objective, our primary strategic defence objective. And there's a small problem with that, in that deterrence is going to fail Australia. And if our current strategy is going to fail Australia, then it's quite logical that we need a new strategy to change direction. So why will our strategy of deterrence fail? First of all, the aims of the United States and the stated aims of Australia are not aligned. The US, as it outlined in the Wolfowitz Doctrine from the 1990s, and it hasn't changed course one iota, It's about primacy. It's about hegemony. Australia's aims, stated aims, don't describe this future. They're talking about peace and stability. But as outlined by Clinton Fernand in his great little book, Sub-Imperial Power, it's pretty clear that some of the elites within this country are quite happy with supporting the US hegemonic position in the world. Now, that's not going to work for the very good reason that the United States' imperial system is in decline. If you look back 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, we can see how sharp that decline has been. And a study of the history of empires suggests that once an empire gets in this position, there's only one way for it, and it's to continue to decline. So I think there's nothing that the United States can do at this stage to turn that around. It can, however, create a whole lot of damage in the interim. The third reason is a major power which wish to threaten us has multiple threat vectors which it could take. So across military, economic, diplomatic means, and many and varied approaches within that, much more than we can actually defend against. So trying to create a defence force to defend against these multiple threat vectors is impossible for a country such as Australia. And the AUKUS submarines are an example of that. They may provide some limited protection, although they're really more an offensive weapon to defend against certain threats and have no impact whatsoever on others. And if we were to try to actually create a defence force that could actually deal with all these threat vectors, we'd very quickly run out of money, and the opportunity cost for Australian society would be enormous. We're already facing huge cost of living pressures. They would only get worse, and the very fabric of our society would start to tear apart, I believe. And the final reason why deterrence will fail, because it doesn't address the underlying causes of potential conflict. And unless we're addressing those causes, we're actually more likely to end up in a conflict. And I think that's the direction we're unfortunately heading. So where are we heading? My working assumption is, assessment, I guess, is that a major regional war is coming. The reason it's coming is the inability of the United States to accept the loss of its hegemonic position in the world. That is the primary driver. And the US is doing everything it can to stir up issues in all parts of the world to make other people look like they're responsible, but you tear all that away, and what's at it is this desire for the United States to maintain its hegemony, to maintain its exceptionalism. Australia will be involved, as the previous presentation highlighted quite clearly. We've handed over our sovereignty via AUKUS, via the Forced Posture Agreement, via our seeming unbridled love for the United States amongst our political class. And what we've effectively done, or our political class has effectively done, is put Australia in a lose-lose situation. So if and when this war comes and we were to be victorious, it would be Pyrrhic victory at best, because what we'll have done is actually destroyed the source of our prosperity, potentially for decades or generations to come. So it's a big own goal, shooting ourselves in the foot. And then if we lose, well, who knows what the actual outcome would be, but we could look forward to our own century of humiliation, similar to what the Chinese suffered during the 19th century, as well as being in a region that I suggest would be mighty unhappy with us because of our participation in the said war. So are there other options? And I guess, we hear a lot amongst the sort of security defence establishment that we're facing the most challenging strategic circumstances since the end of the Second World War in Australia. I don't buy that. And I look at other countries and wonder, what are they thinking? So if we look at Vietnam, for example, and I think they have an excellent defence policy, which is focused on no military alliances, no siding with one country against another, no foreign military bases on its soil, and no use or threat of force in international relations. So if we consider the history of Vietnam with regards to China, which obviously shares a land and sea border, has been invaded multiple times over the centuries, if Vietnam can be confident enough as a nation to have that defence policy, given its position in the world, I see no reason whatsoever why Australia could not. And then we look at Malaysia's defence policy, and some of the rhetoric in there is great. So that greater emphasis on diplomacy, a defensive posture, and our defence strategy is clearly not defensive. Viewing force as a last resort, whereas we come whenever the United States calls. And importantly, it's mention of the Charter of the United Nations. You read our Australian National Defence Strategy, it does not mention the United Nations or its charter once. However, it does mention the rules-based international order or global order multiple times, which is really just a euphemism for the United States' hegemonic position in the world. So how do we build this? We need to get away from this negative peace view of security where the absence of violence is what we consider to be peace. We need to actually build the attitudes, the institutions and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies, both here in Australia and within our region. By doing so, we will provide the optimal environment for human potential to flourish. And when we create those conditions, the likelihood of conflict obviously reduces significantly. It's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. So we have the 8 pillars of positive peace, which is from the Institute for Economics and Peace. And I've done a little bit of a traffic light system on where I think we are across a number of these pillars. On the whole, it's not looking good. Our government, I think, is largely controlled by foreign interests and corporate interests. Accountability and transparency is going down. And the level of political debate, like some of the things we debate over, I think they're largely distractions and get the masses, focusing on things other than the real issues. So we're not doing particularly well there. We're becoming more inequitable, and our foreign aid budget is declining over time. So if we want to secure a region, we need to do our bit, and I think increasing our aid is an important part of that. The free-for-all of information, you might have seen the recent misinformation and disinformation bill that was put into the parliament. Basically, what that would have given is some government apparatchik the right to fine social media companies, which would then have a chilling effect on the ability of people to actually express their thoughts and views and opinions in social media, in effect, handing back control of the narrative to the government. So rather than trying to attempt to deal with the reasons why government has lost control of the narrative, it's about that 1984 approach to cutting off the flow of information. Good relationships with our neighbours, like DFAT's funding has gone down whilst the military expenditure's gone up. So we need to reverse that. We need to increase our English language, foreign languages, particularly Asian languages, so we can have a better understanding of the region that we live in, because that ignorance is what helps us to breed this quite irrational anti-China fear that we have in this country. And the last one I'll cover is the acceptance of rights. The way we treat whistleblowers such as David McBride, the only person jailed out of the whole Afghanistan's war crimes issue, is quite abhorrent. And our selective outrage on human rights. So if it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, any of those countries, we're straight in the bandwagon talking about human rights. But seeing what's happening in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, now by Israel, and the most we hear is gravely concerned from our foreign minister, this cynical and hypocritical approach needs to be fixed if the region is to see us as a legitimate country and not just the poodle of the United States. So are there models that we can follow? And I think, yes, there are. Now, the United Nations is far from perfect, but it's the best thing we've got. The reason I put that up there is if Australia actually followed the United Nations Charter at all times, as opposed to when it suited us, we'd be much better off. So I think as a nation, we need to recommit to the United Nations Charter. We played an important role in forming it, and we're strayed away from that because of our alliance with the United States. And then we've got 2 other organisations which are important in our region, ASEAN and BRICS, or BRICS Plus now. They're both consensus-based organisations. They're both working to build the mechanisms that will address issues rather than coming to conflict. So we have these models, they're growing in strength, and Australia is on the wrong side of history if we don't sort of support the avenue that these organisations are taking. Some concluding thoughts. In my view, the next 3 to 5 years are the most dangerous. If we get through the next 3 to 5 years without a war with China, I think the United States will be so far down the decline path, it'll probably have time for some rational people in that country's leadership to actually think, well, we actually need to work with the world as it is rather than try to impose our will upon it. The biggest barrier we have is the cultural programming. And that's sort of why I mentioned the journey I had on the start, because I know how difficult it is to go from being all in, thinking we're the good guys, we're supporting defenders of democracy, etc., to realise that is largely a load of manure, and then work out what's happening in the world. So that's what most of the population is still at. But I am heartened. You see on social media, I think in particular, a growing recognition that who we are as a nation is not what we say we are. Legacy media, and I include in that the ABC, I think is doing a terrible job in international relations. It's more managing a narrative than trying to inform us. But there is a growing, incredible alternate media universe there, which I think we need to follow and support. And I've put up there the Multipolar Peace grouping. They're commentators from around the world. Some of them with many hundreds of thousands of followers are coming together to try and work towards a peaceful future. If you're only getting your news from our legacy media, you leave yourself open to being made to think a certain way. So at the very least, you need to open yourself up to other sources of information so you can make a better appraisal of what's happening in the world. Those people pushing us towards war never waste a crisis, no matter how small. You can even see with the pages exploding in Israel, or by Israel in Lebanon, that has been turned into we need to protect our supply chains from China, even though China had nothing to do with it. So they never waste a crisis. We need to do the same thing. Anytime there's an issue with AUKUS, we need to be as loud as possible to put the government on the defensive, to make them try to defend themselves. And if enough of us do that regularly enough, hopefully we'll start to crack through some of the policies, the poor policy choices that we've made. Civil society's never been more important in this country. So it's great we have organisations such as IPAN and War Powers Reform, which I'm part of. We need to get as many people involved in that because our government is unfortunately, I don't think, governing in our interests. And finally, I believe someone rather important once said that security in Asia is what Australia should be looking at rather than security from Asia. And we're going to, our geography says we're going to be here an awful long time. So the sooner we come to terms with living in Asia, the better. And I think part of that is also coming to terms with our own past since Europeans arrived. Thank you.